Okay, I think we're going to get started close to right on time. I want to welcome everyone again to our program series with the Wharton Esherick Museum. I'm Emily Zilber. I'm the Director of Curatorial Affairs and Strategic Partnerships, and I'm really excited for you to join us today for our Creatives on Esherick talk with Aspen Golann, who I'll introduce you to in just a moment. First, I want to let you know about a couple of upcoming virtual programs that I hope you'll participate in. July 13th at 3, our next Creatives on Esherick conversation is with Jason Turnage, who won 3rd place in this year's juried woodworking exhibition. We're going to talk about intersections between woodworking, manufacturing, and architecture with him, so that should be really interesting. July 14th, I'll be over talking with our good friends at the Center for Art in Wood about Esherick on a panel connected to their current show with Tom Lozier. So I hope some of you will take a foray away from us and then come right back July 27th at noon. That's when our next spotlight talk on the homemade bandsaw that Esherick used and his shop practices will be. So you can find information on all of these programs, including recordings of past programs, on our website. And I think Katie, who is here helping us out today, will be dropping some links in the chat. We also hope that you'll come and visit us here at the museum, which is where I'm doing this program for you right now, which is very exciting. Come make an appointment to come see us. We're open again to the public on a limited capacity. You can find available times on our website. When you're here, you'll be able to see Wood End, our juried exhibition, and including the work of Aspen. So there's a chance to come and see her piece in person, which is great, as well as work by Roberta Masich, artist in residence. That'll be up through December. And actually behind me, we have some of the custom ceramic pieces that she made based on the studio that are available for sale in our gift shop, which is really exciting, and online. So check those out. So I'm pleased to welcome Aspen back to WEM today. You may have seen her give an amazing presentation at our Wood End opening. So you got a taste there if you attended of Aspen's incredible work and ideas. I'm really glad that we get to dig in a little deeper with her today. Aspen, of course, won the first prize in this year's juried exhibition, and we're so happy to have her as a representative for this show. Aspen is an artist and studio furniture maker. Until recently, she ran the wood studio at the Penland School of Craft. She specializes in 17th and 18th century style furniture, which she blends with a background in fine art, sculpture, and textiles. She holds a degree from the North Bennett Street School in Boston, Massachusetts, where she studied American period furniture. Her work has been exhibited and published widely, including in, and I hope you'll take a look, our print-on-demand catalog for the Wood End exhibition, which is available through the website. We've just got these in our hot little hands today, which is very exciting. And among other accolades, she was awarded the 2020 John D. Minnick Furniture Fellowship by the Society of Arts and Crafts in Boston. She serves on the board of a workshop of our own and as an ambassador to the board of Fine Woodworking magazine. So an amazing background here. We'll dig into it more. We'll have about 30 minutes of conversation. I'll ask you to mute yourself if you haven't already, and then we'll have some time for questions and conversation at the end. So please feel free to put questions in the chat throughout. We'll have some of my WEM colleagues there to answer them as we can. And if not, we'll get to them during the Q&A portion of the conversation. So without further ado, let's welcome Aspen to WEM, to virtual WEM. Hi, Aspen, how are you?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm doing really well. It's not a million degrees here like I hear it is in the rest of the country. So.
And I know you're a little peripatetic. Where are you coming to us from today?
I'm currently in like right outside of Penland, North Carolina.
Fabulous, fabulous. Well, first I want to say congratulations on winning the first prize in this year's juried exhibition. I'm going to pull up an image, and I'd love to start off with a close look at this really remarkable work, partially draped cabinet. So let's get that up so everyone can see. So can you give us an overview of the work and tell me a little bit about your thinking in making it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I still every time you say, won first place in this, I feel like I'm like in an alternate timeline. So anyway, thank you for that. Like very, very beyond honored. So this work is kind of it's a part of a series of pieces that I started making when I was at the North Bennett Street School. That kind of plays with simultaneously celebrating and critiquing like, the history of American decorative arts. And by that, I mean I sort of incorporate these really traditional ways of building furniture, constructing form, and even making imagery. But the imagery that I create is original and contemporary. So I go sort of into that by saying, that I sort of personify my pieces by incorporating that imagery and using those traditional techniques, and using this to talk a lot about historical and present day social inequities. So this specific piece is talking a lot about the relationship between gender and furniture forms and the way that those function. So in a lot of my work, the furniture itself is performing stereotypically female domestic roles. So the way I like to describe that is, furniture performs invisible labor, right? It like welcomes people into a home, it hosts, it bears weight, and it's seen and not heard. And those are all things that we stereotypically like associate with the way that women navigated domestic spaces and still do to some extent. So in this cabinet, sort of the positioning of those female bodies and the loose cloth, I think if you go to the next slide, it's sort of a close front. I could be wrong. Sort of transform the act of opening those doors into a disrobing. So merely by using the cabinet as it's intended, the user kind of violates those figures by removing their coverings and entering the internal space of that cabinet carcass. And if you go to the next slide, I think I draw a connection, yes, between the like classic American Samuel McIntyre carvings. There's a very famous American carver. He uses these draped catenary curves in his carvings a lot. So I was riffing off of those too. So if you're a true furniture nerd, maybe you pick up on that as well. So yeah, that intent, right, of like combining these iconic decorative motifs with that functional cabinet, which sort of starts to get into these ideas of female objectification and domestic labor.
And it's so interesting to me too that you've done it in a way that sort of perfectly exemplifies the power that comes from the sort of thesis of the Wood End show, right? Which is inspired by Esherick combining wood and other materials. And here you've got this combination of materials that allow this furniture piece to do something that it couldn't have done on its own.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I was thrilled when I saw the call for work for this particular show, just because so much of my work is about sort of combining traditional woodworking with other things that I'm fascinated by. Like I just can't seem to hold myself down in terms of the range of interests. And so, yeah, I mean, finding ways to sort of, and I think we'll talk about this, incorporate my past interests in drawing and painting and textiles into my woodworking. And woodworking for me is still like very new process. I graduated from North Bennett about 2 years ago, and my experience at North Bennett was my first, solid wood working. So it's been a very cool, strange, intense 4 years. Yeah.
I can only imagine. I can only imagine. I mean, it's a great segue to taking that step backwards. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what brought you to woodworking, what brought you to furniture, because you have had this sort of varied creative and artistic life before arriving, say, at North Bennett Street School 4 years ago.
Yeah, it's true. It took me until my 30th birthday, or like 2 months before it, to enroll at North Bennett. But yeah, I mean, I sort of describe myself as a serial crafter since birth. So I used to like ride my bike to the library, and I remember sitting in the aisle just like surrounded by books, having pulled every single thing off the shelf. I was really specifically into any kind of how-to manual and like anything from animal husbandry to architectural drafting, and I was obsessed with miniatures and controlling tiny home spaces. I remember like running home just to organize my dollhouse again and again and again. So I mean, at various points in my life, I've seriously pursued any like drawing, weaving, sculpture, bookbinding, I was into welding for a while. Conceptual art was an interest for a long period of time, and I think still is relevant to my work today. And so getting started in woodworking, yeah, it was just a few months before I turned 30. And I think that I think the way I like to think about it is that, like many women, I lived in a world that largely assumed that I had no interest in woodworking. And in turn, that made me think that I had no interest in woodworking. You know, there weren't a lot of clear bars against it, but there was no, I never saw any community that made me think that there was a future for me in that field. Um,
Yeah,
so
the outreached hand wasn't there, even if there wasn't a clear barrier.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so I think that is what I credit for, you know, it having taken so long for me to see myself in a wood shop. Um,
Mm.
Yeah. So, I mean, I ultimately, my first woodworking experience at all was taking some sculpture classes in college, where I had a really life-changing professor who helped me sort of evolve my drawing practice into more three-dimensional design practice.
Mm.
But it took me a really long time to build up the courage to admit to myself that I wanted to be a professional maker. Um, and I think just, again, not seeing myself in the field made me hesitate, and I just sort of pursued other mediums. You know, I think like a lot of us, we're just interested in making, right? And that can be sort of filtered in through like a lot of different processes. Um, so after, I guess, trying nearly everything else, I finally just faced the fact that I wanted to make furniture more than anything else. So, and I guess when I think about what drew me to it ultimately, it's this sort of balance between form and function. And I
Mm.
think really a lot of furniture makers echo that sort of love of boundaries, which is a strange thing to admit, you know, but that I actually feel more creative and more energized by a certain amount of limitation, right? It's like I'm one of those people that plays better inside a fence than in a wide open field, right? Like I like to know what to push up against. I find that those boundaries are kind of creative catalysts for me. So yeah.
Absolutely. That friction, I think, is a source of inspiration for many artists. And in some ways, I love that you came to this. I don't want to say 30 years later because it's not later, but that you came to this not sort of fresh out of undergrad, you know, because it mirrors Esherick's own trajectory, right? Esherick did not start working with wood or making furniture until until he was in his 30s, and trained in other forms of art making, including image making.
Mhm.
I'm curious if you can walk us a little bit more in depth through that shift and sort of share a little bit more about what you see as the possibilities that exist in this kind of combination of image and furniture form.
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually I have some more images for this,
Great.
that sort of touch on some of my drawings. So the whole process was kind of a shift from drawing to furniture and then sort of back again. So drawing was like my first love. It was the practice that my interest in art was funneled into. And I think it was initially due to the, you know, relative safety and accessibility of the materials of drawing, right? And then later, also to a function of gender discrimination and assumptions, as well as my own sort of discomfort in woodshop spaces. You know, that friction, that's a less pleasant form of friction, right? um, so exactly. And then like later on in my experience, I found that I think actually if you switch to the next
Sure.
image, yeah. So these are just sort of some of the pieces that I made at North Bennett when I was first starting. That demi-lune table is one of them, and then this little box is another. So when I was at NBSS at North Bennett Street, I started, you know, like most people, noticing signs of burnout, but basically from making work that was just so complex, pushing myself as hard as I possibly could, and always making things that were kind of on the very edge of my, you know, professional capacity. And I was exhausted. And so I think just, yeah, keep clicking. I think there are a couple more just images, yeah, from that series. So I was really craving the freedom and impulsiveness of drawing. I wanted to be able to sort of doodle or iterate more quickly. Like I've talked a lot about how in furniture, you know, it's just such a long game. You go from an idea, you know, while you're walking around, to a doodle, to a full drawing, to the milling and drying. And oh my gosh, it's like 7 weeks later, you get to see whether your idea was any good, right? When you're like standing in front of it. Um,
Right.
yeah, which is, it's a long period of time. And so I don't mean to only focus on that, but I mean that like when you can't iterate quickly, and by that I mean have an idea, see it, change it, see it again, change it, and then see it again, it really slows down the process of growth. And so for me, I felt that like just my aesthetic evolution was moving too slowly and I needed to draw. So wait, click a couple more. I think there's, these are just some more pieces that I made during that time when I was really just focused on woodworking and exhausting myself. Yeah. So after that first semester at North Bennett, I went and did, this is a good place to stop. I went and did a residency at the Vermont Studio Center, where I started playing with these large scale drawings. And so these drawings you're looking at, these are like taller than I am, they're about furniture size, because I think I got pretty attached to that scale. And so they started to mix furniture and human imagery. And that's when I started to see the connection between my furniture practice and my drawing practice. So if you click to the next image, you'll see, I think, these are just a couple more of those weird drawings that are merging these traditional forms, furniture forms with human bodies. Exactly. Okay. So this is a good place to stop. So then I went back and sort of pursued marquetry and glass enameling as a way of directly incorporating that drawing process into the finished furniture, rather than just using drawing as sort of a generative like ideation process. So you can see even in that little marquetry face, I mean, it's not using an airbrush, which is what I was using for the previous drawings, but it's using the exact same sort of visual style, right? Except using sand shading, which is typical of the era. I think the next piece is of the clock. I hope I put in, okay. And that's actually jumping back to the airbrush, but not using like traditional airbrushing ink. It's actually using glass enamels. So I had to alter my airbrush in order to spray glass enamel, but it's a fascinating material. It's essentially highly pigmented crushed glass that you fire in a kiln with the sheet glass, and the sheet glass and the crushed glass at the right temperature kind of turn into a jelly structure at the same time, and then they cool down, and as they cool down, the pigment essentially just becomes glass, and so it's like you can't scratch it off. It's integrated into the sheet. So that's actually what the piece at the Esherick now was done in the same style. And this is the first time I'm releasing photos of this next project. So if you want to click, I think,
Sure.
yeah, I just finished this the day before yesterday. So these are just some close-up shots of a settee, a Windsor style Hitchcock settee that Greg Pennington and I built together about a month ago. And then I came back and airbrushed, again, using this style. You'll notice the catenary curves, you'll notice the hands. I think the next image is of the entire seat. Yeah. So
for something like this, Aspen, are you making drawings on paper before and then sort of transferring them to furniture, or how does the drawing practice sort of relate to the development of the form? How do those two things come together?
Man, well, wouldn't that be smart if I did that? Sometimes, so for the piece in the Wood and show, what I did was I took a bunch of paper and traced out the shapes, because I'd already built the entire form, which seems like the entire piece of furniture, which seems to be my process. I might have to intervene at some point and actually sort of design the imagery simultaneously. But for now, I like to build the entire thing and then sort of go in and sort of see how much I can change it just by adding images, right? Without actually changing it at all. So just purely through the decorative process, how much can I shift the way that piece is perceived? So the way I did it with the wood and piece was just, tracing pieces of paper that fit into those barred cabinet doors and then drawing on them until something felt right. For this piece, it was a much more ridiculous process where I basically covered the entire thing in like thick purple tape and then drew all over that purple tape until it felt right, and then started cutting out pieces and airbrushing in. It was exhaustive, but
well, that's exciting. I think we're gonna talk a little bit more about the fellowship and the work that you're doing towards the end, but I wanna so I think we'll probably come back to this piece, but I wanna take it back to your first encounter with Esherick's work and what it was about the work that interested you. I mean, certainly, I'm sure, not knowing this sort of commonality that you two had in terms of the relationship between image and form making.
Oh yeah. I mean, honestly, that wasn't even the thing that first appealed to me about it. I mean, it's definitely a connection that I can see very clearly now. But my first exposure to it really was through my older brother, who is an artist himself and is a big fan of architecture. And I remember hearing about Esherick from him. Um, and my strongest memory that I really associate with Esherick and his practice is basically like handmade items permeating a home. And I
Mm.
remember being a little kid and sort of standing and looking at a handmade door, right? And like, because I was a small child, latches are, right at my eye level. So that was just this weird sort of clicking moment where I realized that sort of individuals, and I didn't realize it in this terminology because I was like 7 years old, but this is how I felt it, right? That individuals can make functional things and spaces, not just things that decorate those spaces, right? Like a drawing. So from that moment onwards, I had, my idea that I wanted to make everything in my house. And it was this ambition that I held on to for a very long time. And I think for me, that has to do with this particular kind of physical curiosity that I have, and that a lot of people I know in my field have. It's this way of sort of engaging with the world through like touching and designing and observing. And I just so like the idea of being surrounded by things that I understand deeply through the process of having made them.
Mm.
I can just imagine like Esherick must have just felt so hugged and reflected by his space.
I think that's fair, and I think people feel that way when they come here, regardless of not having been the ones who've made the objects, and hopefully you will feel that way. I think we're hoping to have Aspen come visit and spend some time with us later this summer. So hopefully you'll get a chance to spend some time in this space and see if that still rings true.
Oh, I guarantee you it will. Yeah. I'll lose myself in a very uncool way immediately. Yeah.
It's everything that happens at Esherick is cool, right?
Love it. Yeah.
I'm curious if you can talk to a little bit about your smalls, that series of work, because I think there's also a connection there with Esherick via this sort of sense of humor, design sensibility, and indeed making things for the actions, the sort of performance of everyday life to have sort of surrounded as you go about your day. So it's very different work than the work that's represented in the Woodland exhibition and what we've talked about now. So I'd love to delve a little bit more into that series, into that sort of body of work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
yeah, you might have to skip a couple of
got you. I love these pictures.
Yeah.
Pictures will.
Oh yeah, those requests sort of about like what sort of spaces in my own life kind of feel like Esherick.
Okay, so let's.
Oh, we don't have, I mean, I think the question was something about sort of those vignettes in my studio that I find.
Yeah.
And my like super quick answer for that would just be like, I don't know if anyone here listens to Cut the Craft podcast, but I'm a big fan. And Brian Beadler, who's a bookbinder, who's one of the hosts of Cut the Craft, said this incredible thing once, that the process is the part of the making that the craftsperson gets to keep. And so when I think about sort of the elements of my process or my space that feel the most meaningful to me, it's like that space from standing right behind my own bench, and so many people see me from across my bench, but sort of for me, that experience of getting to stand behind it and have all my tiny little tools just like project around me, like that is that Eshericky moment, right? Of just sort of feeling like all of these items have been sort of collected around me based on this weird magnet of my own interests, right? And like organized. And so it's just, in those moments where I'm like, who am I? What am I even doing anymore? It's like I look around and like these things reflect who I am and what I'm interested in, and I will use them. And like it's just this, it's a nice cycle of like seeing and knowing myself. I know that's very abstract, but that's how I feel.
I think it's not abstract, and I think the way that folks relate to their tools and how their tools exist in their spaces, it makes perfect sense to me. This is your studio space in North Carolina.
Yeah, that is. Mm-hmm.
How is it? Well, I guess we'll talk a little bit more later on about how it's felt to leave that space and to do some journeying.
Yeah, and we can totally talk about the smalls now. Yeah,
let's do that. We'll come back to that.
There they are. Yeah, I mean, my small work is typically really playful, and I think that the reason for that is that like the playfulness is a much easier quality to attain when the work is small. It's hard to pursue a really lighthearted idea when the work is super arduous, right? When it's small, it can be improvisational. I think my smalls kind of do that. They like capture a moment. And the standard for me for determining which pieces get made is basically, do they spark curiosity or like make me giggle? And I feel like with large scale furniture, there has to be a much different standard for what gets made, because it takes me I need to be so much more confident before I'm willing to commit the time to make a larger piece. So a lot of these just, they have a quality that my big furniture, I haven't yet been able to capture in my big furniture, right? Because that sense of play sometimes gets lost after 8 weeks of like, carving it.
Well, and I'd say too, an aesthetic sensibility that feels sort of very separate from the history of the decorative arts, which really informs a lot of the work that we looked at in the first part of the presentation. Do you think about sort of the aesthetic sensibility differently for these two bodies of work, or have they just sort of manifested differently?
They're definitely have a different sensibility behind them, for sure. I think the point of connection is actually the process.
Mhm.
So some of them, like if you go back a few slides, there's a candelabra, right? So that those little wiggles and those laminations, all of those came from, or I got the idea from them from a short class on historical banding. So little inlays in traditional furniture that are just like a very highly complex little slice of veneered wood that's organized into like diamond patterns or straight lines, like tiny stripes. And so seeing that, there was just something about those that sparked my curiosity. I collect little broken bits of things, that people have thrown away. And so grab those things, and I have like a little Tupperware that I keep them in. And so just spilling out this little Tupperware that by its own nature, because I collected it at North Bennett Street School, is like all these pieces and like, broken bits of traditional process, and then using those to like inspire these pieces, so part of it is just the fact that that's how I was taught. So that's the process that I use. But yeah, it's funny, like, again, enough of a uber nerd might be able to see historical banding in this. I don't know. My friend, I think I saw my friend Mark, who used to work at Winter Tour, and I think he might riff on this. He might see it. Or some of you do too. Yeah. So I think that's the connection, if I had to draw one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about, and in some ways connects to, there's a question that I wanted to ask you about, that legacy of knowing the history of the decorative arts and figuring out how to bring that into the present, of connecting to artists or makers or ideas of the past, and thinking about what's generative about being a contemporary artist who's working within those paradigms and thinking about the past, but also as an artist who's an educator in this field, where you think really having that as your background has helped you develop your own voice.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question, and it's one I haven't been asked before, so you have to forgive my first sort of reaction to it, is that I feel like meaning, in my mind, meaning depends highly on context. So as the context of a piece of furniture shifts over time, so does its meaning, right? So there's this old idea that you can't introduce a new idea into a canon without shifting all the ideas that came before it. And I sort of believe that like that metaphor of sort of like a plate or a cup being placed on top of a teetering pile of other plates, all the dishes below kind of shift in order to accommodate the new piece. So I think like having a relationship with the past in terms of past aesthetics means relating to an ever-changing thing. So, which is a little bit counterintuitive given that the past is like over. However, meaning is constantly evolving in relation to new work and ideas and cultural evolution. So I think that by sort of engaging with the past and making work that is related to it, I think in some ways we actually shift the context in which we view the past, and therefore actually kind of change it, at least in relation to like the current context.
I'm gonna get this wrong, but I think it's Faulkner who never passed.
Yes, I'm like, where did I hear this? Yes, isn't the plate metaphor fantastic? It's such a natural way of understanding the way that like new ideas that are related to a whole series of prior ones shift all of the others. Yeah.
I think that's actually in a lot of ways a perfect segue to talking about what you're most excited about in your work right now. You're in this sort of big transitional moment, having recently been awarded the Minute Furniture Fellowship. And I'd love to hear about what you're up to and where you think it's going to take your practice.
Yeah, I mean, that is another one another statement that makes me feel like I'm living an alternate timeline whenever won the Minute Award. I'm like, oh my God. Anyway, so yeah, that was an incredible honor. And it has really changed this year for me. And I hope that it changes, my career going forward. And I've tried to use it in a way that changes other people's careers going forward too. So I'll get into that a little bit. Just give you a super quick introduction to, I guess, like my project is 3-part, and I'm not going to touch on all of them just because it's epic and long-winded. But basically, the sort of the field of green woodworking and chair making can feel very small at times. And in many ways it is, but it doesn't have to be. So I think as traditional woodworking techniques have been like eliminated from mainstream furniture production, like the tools and education for those techniques get harder and harder to find. And it gets harder and harder to facilitate these classes. So there's just communities of historically excluded craftspeople who feel isolated or pushed out. And it just doesn't have to be like that, I think. So I started this project called the Chairmaker's Toolbox, which has this twofold mission. And that's what this little chair is actually part of the first part. So great, perfect timing. So I want to travel and teach Windsor chair making because I think it's a super accessible physically. It's super accessible in terms of the cost of the tools and the cost of the materials. And you don't even need an electrical outlet technically in order to make a Windsor chair, which is crazy. So it should be one of the most accessible forms of furniture, but it's not. So in order to teach, I needed to design a very simple object because that's one of the other things about Windsor chair making is the chairs are very complicated and it requires like a 7-day commitment. And by 7 days, I mean like 7 12-hour days. So I made this chair, this very simple chair that really, it captures all of the different techniques that you need to learn in order to make a Windsor, but it doesn't require that degree of commitment. And it allows people to really design around the bones of a Windsor structure. Yeah, at least that was the goal. So the second piece of the project is addressing the shortage of tools. So you can't
Should I go
Huh?
to the next image here? Or
oh yeah, sorry. There's the first class that we taught. It was a really wonderful experience. And I think I actually put in one other picture of beautiful nerds using tools. Yeah. So this is a class that I ran out of Greg Pennington's shop, also in Tennessee.
Great.
So that was a really wonderful experience and just further confirmed to me that I would like to run a little chair tour, a number of them over the course of the next few years where I travel around the country and hit a number of cities in a row and teach these classes at community craft spaces. But again, in order to do that, I need tools. So I think the next slide is some of the examples of some of these weird tools that you need in order to make Windsor chairs. And the funny thing is like these tools are just not findable anywhere. So I started collecting sort of names in my community of really talented metal workers who could produce some of these tools. And so then I connected with those metal workers with established Windsor chair makers so they could prototype back and forth. So the next picture I think is of some of those Zoom calls. Yeah, so here you see Caleb James Zooming with David Clemens, who's an incredible metal worker on a spoke shave, and then Andrew Mears and Megan Martin talking to Peter Galbert about a draw knife. So this is again like I think I introduced this one other time, but you guys are still one of the first groups to see the actual tools. So if you want to see them, each of these makers, these are just some prototyping images. This is David playing with a spoke shave, and I think the next one is Megan messing around. Yeah, that's Mears, Andrew Mears playing with the draw knife. And the next one is Megan forging. Yeah. And now we have some images of tools. Yeah, they're just some gorgeous pictures of them working. Yeah. So this is the finished draw knife. Gorgeous thing. Next slide is a picture of the makers, Andrew Mears and Megan Martin, who are based out here in Penland, North Carolina. Next slide. We'll just scroll through them quickly. This is the tenon cutter by Kelly Harris, who is a woodworker, furniture maker in Brooklyn, New York. So it's the next picture is of her in her studio. She's a good friend and an incredible maker. Next slide. Yeah, this is a infill mallet made based on the Studley tool chest made by Eleanor Rose. And the next photo is of her. Yeah, she also makes a bunch of other things too, so definitely check her out. Next one, I believe, yes, is a fro made by, and if you go to the next slide, Rachel Kettinger, who made the Blade, and Mary Ellen Hitt, who did all of the turning. And they're based in Philadelphia and Maine, respectively. Next. This is a carving axe made by, the next slide, Julia Kaltoff, who's in Sweden. And next, Travisher. And this one's been in production by, next photo, Claire Minahan for the last like 8 years. So I can claim no credit over this. I just bought a bunch. Not that I can claim credit for any of these things. Next is, next and last, I believe, is the Spoke Shave Yes by David Clemens. So the next photo is him working. Yeah, so it's been an incredible experience, sort of just using whatever sort of network connections I've been able to build in my community in order to sort of empower people and connect them so that they can be self-sufficient and, you know, productive and paid members of this green woodworking community going forward. And I get these gorgeous tools to work with. So win, 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 win.
And we can also make sure that in the follow-up email we send, we can link to all of the tool makers that you're working with, and all of their, because they're all incredible artists in their own right beyond what they're doing with you.
Yeah, website forthcoming. Yeah.
So what's the next step after this? Where is this taking you? Where's the
teaching, okay. Traveling, and the last part, or not the last part, but another part of my Midnight project. I clearly overcommitted, but in a way that I think will be cute going forward, is basically making this sort of more advanced work that speaks to marginalized experiences in the field. And so that's where that large settee came from. And I'm actually moving back to New England to work with Peter Galbert, another Windsor chairmaker, who actually originally taught me. And so he and I are going to get to collaborate. I'm actually going to be traveling to Texas to learn marquetry from Frank Straza, who's a really incredible furniture maker. He and I are going to collaborate on some stuff. So just sort of trying to build these connections in the community to try to learn as many skills as I can, and then trying to disseminate them to other people, and also, you know, use them effectively in my artwork. Because I know that that's one of the things that the MNIC is supposed to really serve, right? Is that filling that gap that happens when you go to school, but that does not mean that you have a functioning business model as a furniture maker, right? I mean, I didn't, let's put it that way. Or, you know, you've made one table. Does that mean you want to go into production making tables? You don't even know if you love making tables. You made one and it was great, but that's all you know. So I think that really trying to use the grant for what it was intended to be used for has been, yeah, just trying to focus on that. Yeah, and there's the link, the next round of applications for the next fellow. I think it's due sometime in August or at the end of this month. So please check it out. And if you have any questions, get in touch with me. Happy to talk about it.
We can figure out a way to make those connections if they come through WEM. So that's
great.
Very generous. Thank you.
Of course, of course.
I'm conscious of time, so I want to make sure we have time for questions from the group. So I'm thinking, we have a couple more photos. Should we talk through these quickly before we are?
Cool. Those are just some nice photos of, again, people making Windsor chairs in these classes that are very intentionally trying to incorporate people. And these are some more tools I need. I'm not even done with this process. So if you have any, have any connections to some metal workers that you think might be interested in being part of the project, also would love to meet them. Those are some of the tools we still need. But I want to hear your questions, please. Yes.
Well, I think we'll stop with the sharing. Thank you so much, Aspen, for being so generous with your time and your practice and your past. We'll open it up now to see if anyone has any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or if you would rather type a question in the chat, feel free to take that route as well. We were so stunned, we just had a sneeze.
Don't all speak at once.
Well, I am happy to ask you another question then, Aspen. How does it feel to be traveling and teaching and not be able to take your studio really with you, right? We said we'd come back to that. when you are on the road doing this work, what does your sort of portable studio look like? How do you make a studio for yourself?
I mean, some of it is that incredible feeling that you get when you're like house sitting for somebody else and, you almost are more focused because there's just nothing of yours around to distract you, So I love going to other people's spaces and it's like, there's just no question that what I'm there to do is make things out of wood, right? I mean, there's no plants to distract me or, dirty clothes or things that I should be organizing. I mean, all of that, all of real life is just on pause. So sort of whatever sort of limitations I have around tools, like I'm always sort of, I feel like that is completely balanced out just by the amount of focus that I'm able to sort of, create in those spaces or experience in those spaces. And so far, the places I've gone have had tools. And when I travel to teach, I'll have to bring them. That's part of the reality of teaching Windsor chair making is like, wood shops can be fully outfitted, but most of them don't have 9 scorps, right? I mean, that's just not part of the practice. So I think that traveling with tools will just have to become part of my world. I'm starting to learn about the cheapest ways to get things on planes, and um, and I'll be getting a new car soon, so I can actually throw everything in the back of that. But yeah, that's not a very interesting answer. But I think that probably the most important part is that idea of like what I lose in access to my own tools, I gain in sort of a sense of like clarity and focus in those other
Mm.
spaces.
I have a question here from Jay Christian, who wants to know if you've worked with Curtis Buchanan and Elia Bazari, who from a craft standpoint seem to be working in a similar direction of disseminating green woodworking knowledge.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, Curtis was the first person who I met in the Windsor chair field when I moved to North Carolina, which is not a surprise. He only lives about an hour away, but I got connected with him through Pete Galbert because I needed to know where to buy logs, and that's one of the things about Windsor chair making that is not accessible at all. Is like, oh, just start with a log. Where do you get a log, right? I mean, and what type of log, and like, where are you going to put the log? So, I mean, the access to materials is one of the toughest parts of the process. And Curtis was incredibly generous, which is something he's famous for. Yeah, he took me to I thought we were just going to do a log purchase, and I ended up going to his house and we made lunch with his wife. And then it turned out the lunch was for her book group and we hadn't read the book. So we had to go get lunch somewhere else. And so then he drove me to, we ate a grilled cheese together, and he's like the mayor of his town, basically. So he's just waving at the doctor and the lawyer and the tax man. And I'm like, this is a beautiful life that this weirdo has created for himself here. And Italy I met at Penland. He taught actually the first class that I was at Penland for as the woodshop manager. So we're all friends. We haven't actually intimately worked together in this way yet because their interest in disseminating sort of woodworking knowledge is not focused on the same demographics that mine is. But I do think we have like a lot to learn from each other. And Curtis and I at least have sort of put our heads together a little bit on that stuff. So I hope that continues going forward.
So that's actually an interesting segue to the question in the chat from Karen, who wants to know about if there's an interest in woodworking from children or younger people, and sort of she's talking about her own experience as an educator, seeing people light up when they see tools, but certainly sort of demographic diversity as it relates to people who might be interested in the kind of work that you do is something that's very much on your mind as a part of this project, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that like working with little kids is, so when I was a teacher for 4 years, but I taught high school. And I think that anything below high school, it's like I'm not as geared towards it. So I find little kids adorable, but I feel like it's harder for me to lock into their headspaces. And so when I was learning to teach, one of the things that we were encouraged to do was just sort of pay attention to the age group that we were drawn to. And for me, that was high school. There was just something about sort of like their balance of like idealism and like bitterness and capacity and like all of these things sort of together I just found really exciting. And I think that they're just so charming. And I know not everybody finds high schoolers charming, so I felt that that was an important thing to pursue. So I think that any younger, kind of scares me. My friend Sylvie Rosenthal has done some really incredible work, green woodworking, making staked furniture with like 7-year-olds. So I would say if you're interested in that kind of work, talk to her. And I think her handle on Instagram is boat. But yeah, just looking up Sylvie Rosenthal. She makes incredible work and she does a fantastic job introducing these concepts to little kids.
Mhm. And then we've got a question from Tom, who asks if you see any significant difference working with female makers rather than male makers.
You know, I mean, it's funny, like I try to not sort of differentiate initially, but I will admit that like, I think that when I work with women, I spend a lot of time introducing and like welcoming their curiosity into the space. So like introducing themselves to their own interest in the material, right? And you can't push it too fast. You can't insist on it, sort of giving people a chance to organically find that they are interested in something. And there are a lot of barriers. There's a lot of feeling dumb. There's a lot of being like, I know what it feels like to be 30 and be like, where's the blade on the hand plane? You know, I mean, nobody likes asking dumb questions, right? But I had to ask those questions and it was scary. And so I think very intentionally creating a space in which an adult can ask a question that feels like maybe they shouldn't have to ask is a hard thing to do. And you'll experience that a lot when you're teaching woodworking to people who've been historically excluded from the field, because it's not that they're not smart enough to use a hand plane. It's quite simply that they haven't been introduced to one before. So
Right.
yeah, just sort of really intentionally like walking into that space with the beginner's mindset and with just a ton of respect for people and where they come from and like where they're at. So yeah, incredibly respectful, incredibly playful, and slow enough that people can jump on at their own pace. Does that make sense?
That's fantastic. Julie, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Sure. Aspen, I was just curious, you had said something akin to finding the courage to admit and just wholly embrace being a maker as your life path. And I wondered, were the hesitations about the lifestyle, the income sort of unpredictability, or was it more rooted in whether you were, was it your talent? You know, where were your insecurities coming from, I guess, is what I'm curious about.
Right. I mean, I think, well, it's hard to know how deep the well goes, right? You know, you're interested. You don't know how interested. Like, are you lifelong interested? Or are you like weekend class interested? But I think that for me, it was really just the practicality of it. It just did not make sense. I remember finding one of those little things that they make little kids fill out, you know, where you draw a picture and then there's writing underneath it. And it says, when I grow up, I want to be and you like draw the thing and then write it down. Mine says, when I grow up, I want to be an artist. And it had a drawing of like a little paintbrush, but then with an X through it. And it said, but they don't make enough money, so I'm going to be a lawyer. And then it was a picture of a briefcase. So, like, you know, I mean, where did I get that idea already as a kiddo? But just, yeah, I mean, clearly like that fear was real for me and it still is, you know, it's one of those things that I don't live underneath it. I live next to it. You know, me and my fear of my, you know, financial situation becoming sketchy or letting sort of the practical aspects of making objects for money sort of choke out the parts that drew me to it in the first place. Those are fears that I still have. But yeah, I think that stuff kept me away from it. And also just knowing nothing about wood kept me away from it. Like knowing that I was not a person, and I think this is another barrier that a lot of women and people of color face and non-binary people face coming into woodworking is like, you can't just walk in and get a job at somewhere. You don't have enough, like a lot of people don't have enough experience. They don't feel safe in like your standard wood shop where people are making furniture. And so I knew I was gonna have to like go to school basically in order to learn enough that I could then feel valuable and that I could actually make choices about where I worked rather than just sort of take what I could. So it was a huge investment to have to make and like crazy leap of faith. And I feel like I did it at just the last moment that I possibly could have. I'm like, I'm just stable enough in my career as a teacher, and I'm still just young enough that I can do this incredibly stupid thing and try to make furniture for a living.
I'm very glad you did it. Thank you for that, Frankie. That's fantastic.
I think we have time for one more question before we have to sign off. Oh, I see. Hi, Terry and Mark. I see a hand raised.
Oh, hello, you two.
There we go. Hi. I had a question about tools. I was just thinking about looking at your shop and many woodworking shops I've seen. There are so many tools. Yours seems a little leaner. And then the idea of traveling and your idea of that small package of tools that you were trying to develop for woodworkers. Is that sort of an added challenge, or is that kind of a freeing thing, the possible minimizing of the amount of tools?
I mean, it's one of the best things about Windsor chair making is that there aren't no tools, but there's a small number, probably about 12 if I had to sort of guess right off the top of my head. And I would say that it's also like, it's not that you're trying to pare down, it's just quite simply that's what it takes, right? You only need that many. And to have extras is cute, but it's not needed, which is cool. And with flat furniture, I found, there's always a justification to get a new scraper, right? Or like a different sort of hand plane, I'm like, oh, I'll definitely need this, or like a smaller router plane because of that one time, right? But with Windsor furniture, it really is just that simple toolkit, and I do find that really freeing. Unfortunately for me, I'm not giving up on flat furniture, so I'm just sort of cultivating like two completely different toolboxes. So that's, if anything, it's like increasing the collection, unfortunately for me and for my partner and I, who are gonna have to move in a couple months.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I know I'm excited to follow and see where the fellowship takes you and what you do over the next bit, and hopefully we can get one of your workshops to come to the Philadelphia area, and I hope other folks have a chance to follow where they are if they're available to them. Thank you so much, Aspen, for being here today with us. Thanks everyone for coming to the event today. I'll ask people if they feel comfortable to turn on their camera, unmute, and say goodbye while we before we close out the session today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Great.
Thank you all for another great program.
Thank you.
Oh, look at all these friendly Christians here. Rebecca. Oh man, Pam. Hey girl.